Hey guys and girls, welcome back to BBR Suspension. Today we are going to be reassembling the TZR 250 shock. I managed to get the seal head a couple of days ago, so we're going to open this up. We're going to take a couple of measurements. What I'm first going to do, I'm going to get the old seal head stripped off the shock shaft, and then we'll open this up and we'll compare notes, take a few measurements of the two, but from what I've seen this is going to work perfectly. So let's get started by stripping the old shock. Let's get cracking. Okay guys, so I've got the shock shaft set up in the soft jaws. These soft jaws, I'll put a link in the description. They're available from Racetech product, very handy tool to have. What I've done, I've basically set up the shock shaft in the soft jaws, in the vise, and then I've clamped, not too sure if I can get the bottom in, but I've clamped the clevis at the bottom onto the vise itself, as these nuts tend to be pretty damn tight. Sometimes you're going to need a little bit of heat. On some of the shafts, the top of the shock shaft is actually peened over, and you need to grind or turn that peening down before you remove the nut so that you don't damage the thread. This one isn't, and it's a solid shaft. It doesn't have any needles on the internal, so we should be good. So let's get loosening. They can be pretty damn tight. There we go. Okay, so once we've got the nut loose, we've got to basically remove the piston plus all the shims. And what we'll do when we get the nut to the end of the thread, we're going to put everything onto a cable tie or a zip tie, whatever you prefer to call it. So what we'll do is we'll take the items off one by one, put them onto a zip tie, so that we don't get the order messed up. So basically, I can show you, these are all your rebound shims, okay? And what we need to do is we need to make sure that we don't upset the order or the sequence of that shim stack, hence the use of a cable tie. What we'll do, we'll take those shims off, get them onto the cable tie. Okay guys, so that's the shock piston. So how it works is on a compression stroke, your oil flows into these channels, okay, and then pushes against the shim stack here, which is your compression shim stack. Those shims will flex under the pressure of the oil, and then what will happen is on the rebound stroke, the oil will flow through the opposite side of the piston on the smaller channels, come out on these, and that will push up against your rebound shims and flex that shim stack to give you oil flow through the ports. Right, so we'll get the piston on, we'll then get the compression shim stack onto the cable tie, and we'll get, that is just a seat or a spacer, okay, and then there's a small circlip on the shaft here that we're going to have to just pick off, and then we've got our bump rubber underneath. So what we'll do, let's see if we can just pick the circlip off. There we go. So we'll get that circlip off. Sometimes they tend to want to climb into the threads. You can actually just wind it off the threads like a nut. Just using your fingernails in the slot for a bit of grip. Right, let's get that circlip off. We'll get that onto the cable tie, and then we'll get the little bump rubber off. So that bump rubber basically will knock up against the back of the seal head on a full compression stroke. Right, so what we'll do, this entire assembly, we just put the cable tie through just to keep it all in one spot. We'll clean this up with a bit of brake cleaner before assembly. I'll do that shortly. Right, then what we're going to do, we're going to loosen the soft jaws and take the shaft out of the soft jaws, because the seal head which sits underneath the jaws needs to come off the shaft next. Okay guys, so we've got the shock piston and all the shim stacks removed from the shock shaft. So this is the original seal head. So basically how this setup works, there's a disc underneath the seal head and a compressible rubber, and the two circlips that we took out of the shock body, one circlip sits basically underneath this. So when the shock gets assembled at the factory, everything gets put together, and when the shock shaft assembly is put in, this washer or disc, let's call it, it's a profile disc, pushes up against the first circlip. The seal head then gets pushed in and the second circlip will sit there. So what will happen is, under a certain amount of force, that rubber, which is free over there, will compress to allow that second circlip to go into the slot. And in compressing, it's going to flare out and seal against the body. So that's how this seal head assembly seals onto the, or between the body and the seal head, creates the seal. That is the seal. It's just a rubber disc, the profile disc. So we're going to take this off. We're basically going to discard that. Then what we'll do, this is the bare shock shaft, and like I explained in the first video, we'll just take the bump rubber off and give it a wipe underneath, just to get the excess dirt that was on the shaft under the bump rubber. When we reassemble, we'll put a smidge of grease under the bump rubber so that any water that does get in there is repelled and it won't create rusting or any issues on the bottom of the shock shaft. Overall, shock shaft still in pretty good condition, so we'll get that assembled shortly. Let's have a look quickly at the new seal head and compare it to the old seal head. Pop that one back there. So, as I explained in the previous video, this seal head is for a 1980 or 81 Yamaha IT250, or sorry, IT200. I think it was used on the 250s as well, and also on the 1980 or 81 YZ80. So the important things is that the overall dimensions on the outside are the same. That's 40 millimeters on the dot and 40 millimeters on the dot. Okay, so guys, we are just going to compare the two seal heads. So the original one, like I explained, that is your seal that pushes out under the compression between the two split rings in the shock body, and that's what creates the seal. So as long as we are sealing with the O-ring in more or less the same place, in other words, that it's not into the second groove, because the second split clip is going to be discarded as well. So what we need to do is we need to check the dimension over there to where the seal sat. So from the top of the groove to where the seal sat is approximately, give or take, 6.22 millimeters. Not that it's a critical dimension. And on this one, we're going to sit at approximately 4 millimeters. The O-ring around the seal head is what now seals against the body. So when the seal head slides into the body, the O-ring compresses against the body. And what will also happen is, from the bottom, you're going to get oil pressure. The oil pressure will push up against the bottom of the O-ring and push it against the top shoulder, which causes it to flare out and form the seal. So overall dimensions from the top of the O-ring groove to where the bump rubber would hit the bottom of the body is about 15 millimeters on the button on the new seal head. The old one would be a combination of those three components. So we would measure from the seal groove to the bottom of the disc, which is, as you can see, bulged out. So I can't get a very, very accurate measurement, but we're going to eyeball it, and that is approximately 15 millimeters as well. So we know that this plan is going to work, just with a slightly different setup. Right, so now what we'll do is we'll start assembling the shock shaft. So what we'll do, we'll get a little bit of grease. I use just a marine grease. I use it for bearings and various things, but this is a good grease to put under the bump rubber. Pretty thick, gooey stuff, but what it does is, by getting under the bump rubber, we ensure that no water can get in and create rust under the rubber on the chrome. So we put a little bit under that plate, and we'll get the bump rubber refitted. Right, so that's good. Then what we've got to do is get the new seal head on, and this is quite an important step, guys. So what you need to do, you need to find a tiny little Ziploc bag like this, or even the corner of a normal shopping bag can work. I take a pair of scissors and I cut the Ziploc section off. Okay guys, so we've cut the Ziploc portion off a little Ziploc bag and cover the tip of your shaft. Good advice in general. Put a little bit of grease onto that Ziploc bag. So basically what the bag does is, the shoulder on the shock shaft is sometimes pretty sharp, and it has a tendency to want to cut the seal. So in the seal head, the outer seal that you see here is only a dust seal. There's another O-ring inside the seal head which forms a hydraulic seal. It creates the barrier between the shock shaft and the shock oil itself. And remember, the shock oil is going to be under pressure once we pressurize the reservoir with nitrogen. So what we do is we take the new seal head and we slide it on, get it over. Sometimes it can be slightly tight, and you'll probably find that Ziploc bag sometimes tears, destroys itself in the process, but we save the seal by using that Ziploc bag. And sometimes you just got to try and grab the remainder of the bag at the bottom. It sticks out at the bottom of the seal, and we'll just get that pulled off and pulled out. Might have to just grab a pair of pliers to get that out. So Racetech do make what they call a seal head bullet, but I don't have those specific Racetech seal head bullets. They're pretty difficult to get hold of, in South Africa at least. We battle to get certain things out of America and other countries. Anyway, I'm going to grab a pair of pliers quickly and just get the remainder of that plastic removed. Okay guys, so we've got the new seal head fitted onto the shock shaft. What I'll do while I'm here, I'm just going to put a little bit of grease onto the O-ring, which is going to form a seal against or between the seal head and the actual shock body. We'll put a little bit of grease on there just to make it a little bit easier when we do the final assembly. Right, then what we're going to do, we're going to refit the shock piston. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to clean the threads on the end, because the nut itself needs to have a little bit of Loctite put on. You don't want that nut coming off. So what we'll do is we'll quickly reassemble everything. I'm going to just give everything a very quick clean with some brake cleaner. Now, for those of you that haven't experienced it yet, getting brake cleaner in your eyes is like getting a gentle massage with a cheese grater. on the surface of your eyeballs. So when you work with brake cleaner, do yourself a favor and get some safety glasses. It's going to save you a lot of pain and anguish. So what we basically do with the brake cleaner, we're just going to, I'll just put this tray on so we can just make a mess into the tray. We're going to basically clean just the threads, make sure there's no oil in those threads. We'll give it a wipe. Some clean paper towel, make sure it's nice and dry. Okay, let's do it once more. I could see a little bit of dirt still coming off. So we'll give them a wipe. Make sure that the cloth itself or the paper towel is pretty clean, means all the dirt's out of those threads. Then what we can do, we'll take the piston and the shims, and we'll do the same. Just give it a good squirt of brake cleaner. Just make sure, give it a slight jiggle, get any excess oil, and we'll spray a little bit of brake cleaner on the internal threads of the nut. Make sure that's clean so that the Loctite can basically hold and set on those threads. Right, so I think we're good to go there. Just give that a little wiggle and a jiggle to dry off. And we can just give it a good old dab with the paper towel. Just try and soak up the rest. It doesn't make too much mess. Let's get that tray up there. So what we're going to do is we're going to reassemble the complete piston with the shims. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do a bit of a temporary clamp fixture here just so that you guys can see this, and then to do the final tightening of the nut, we'll move back to the vise with the soft balls. So what we can do is we can snip that zip tie, cable tie, and we prefer to call it, and we're going to start reassembling the items basically in the opposite order that they came off. So first will be the bump rubber. That bump rubber, in the event of a full bottom out, will press against the bottom of the seal head. We then have the little O-ring, or sorry, not O-ring, split ring, which needs to go past all those threads. Again, we might have to just try and turn that down, but let's see if we can speed this up a little bit. Just take a few turns to get that thing on. Then we grab the seal pick. We can see if we can get it on the seal pick. So we managed to get it past the threads, and we'll get it into the groove where it lives. There we go. So that split ring is in the groove now. The bump rubber will sit underneath it, and then the spacer, so it's got a little recess in it that'll go over that split ring. So once the split ring is in that recess, it can't flare outwards. The recess will hold that split ring in. So you can see that spacer sits up against the split ring. We are then going to assemble the first shim stack. So we're going to take that off very carefully, and we're going to wiggle and jiggle it over and onto the shaft. We'll then fit the piston, and lastly we'll fit our rebound shim stack, the top spacer. Right, what I'm going to do, I'm going to move this over to the soft balls and set it up in the other vise again so that we can put the nut on with a bit of Loctite and tighten that up. And then we'll give the Loctite a couple of minutes to dry. So let me get this set up on the other vise. Be back in a second. Okay guys, so we've got the shock shaft set up in the soft jaws again. Basically I'm going to put a little bit of Loctite onto the threads to keep the nut from coming loose. This is a product called Axima, something I've had for quite a while. You can see the bottle's been well used, all the grease and grime on it. Equivalent to the blue Loctite, so it's not super strength, but basically we get a little bit of this onto the threads. Just get a couple of drops here and there. Not too much. And what we'll do, we'll get the nut on. We'll nip it up. So these nuts are what they call, this specific one is called a pinch nut. So it's actually at the factory, the thread gets deformed on every second landing, so that it actually binds onto the thread similar to a lock nut. So you'll feel it starts to bind up once you reach the top, but you just put it on, give it a little nip. It doesn't have to be super tight, just fairly, I would say, if you were using a torque wrench, in the region of about 30 to 35 Newton meters. You just wipe off the excess Loctite, and we'll give the Loctite in that thread 10 minutes to dry, and then we can assemble. Okay guys, so we've got the shock shaft assembled again. Basically the retainer, bump rubber, the dust seal cap that exploded on the press, the new seal head. Then we've got the bump rubber on the inside, which basically that is going to hit the bottom of the seal head on full extension. And then we've got our piston with the shim stacks assembled. So we're going to give that Loctite a couple of minutes to dry. While that's drying, I'm going to refit the preload rings onto the shock body, because those need to go back on before we assemble. Okay guys, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to fit the preload rings back onto the shock body, and I'm also going to refit the O-ring that forms the seal between the actual body and the piggyback cartridge. So again, a little bit of grease just to help everything bed in. Grease is your friend on these things, because the water gets in between the threads and it forms an oxide layer, because the threads very seldomly turn. So a little bit of grease to stop the water getting in, and then basically we'll put our top preload ring on first. That's the locking ring. So you just got to feel it onto the threads, turn it backwards until you feel the threads engage, and then wind them forward. As it gets into the grease, it will form a little bit of drag. Spread the grease through the threads. Is pretty much what we want. Get that excess grease off and put it into the threads underneath for the second preload ring. I'm going to put a smidge more grease onto the threads. We're going to get the second preload adjuster ring on. Okay, so those preload adjuster rings are gliding nicely on those threads. Then what we're going to do on the top section where the piggyback reservoir goes on, I'm going to refit the O-ring. Everything's been cleaned. We're going to put a little bit of grease into the slot where the O-ring goes into. And what we'll do, we'll put a little bit of grease on the O-ring itself, just so that it goes on nicely. There we go. Right, so that is prepared and ready to go back together. While we're here, I'm also going to put the split ring that holds the actual piggyback reservoir on. I'm going to put that split ring on. It's easier to do it now. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to give this a very light smear of grease. It does have a little bit of rust on it, so we just want to prevent that rust from causing issues. What we'll do is that split ring needs to get pulled apart to go over the shock body, and we'll have it ready there. Right, then the next step, just get this grease off the hands. The next step on the piggyback reservoir, I explained when we dismantled the shock, there's a piston, and that piston moves up and down inside the reservoir. So what we need to do, we need to measure the position of the piston, and I use a little tool that I made. It's basically a stainless rod and a little brass handle. What we do, we put it against the bottom of the piston. Okay, there's a divot in the piston. I mark it, and what I'm going to do is just make a mark with a little Sharpie pen on there. So what we'll do is when we start reassembling, if the piston moves, we'll just check the piston position before doing the final nitrogen charge in the reservoir or the piggyback. Right, so that's the position of the piston. You can see the mark that we've made. If we drop that in, lines up with the edge, so that we know the position of that piston. Right, the next stage is to start adding oil into the piston. We'll then get the piston back on and get the clip in position, and then we're going to start adding oil into the shock body. Okay guys, so we're going to start with the assembly now. On most of the shocks I do, I've actually found that a 5-way cork oil works pretty well. Shock oils are not available from all manufacturers, and quite honestly they are difficult to get hold of in South Africa. I have tried a few different oils over the years, but I found that 5-way cork oil works pretty good. I use the Ravenol stuff, pretty good stuff. Right, so we're going to get assembling. So what we're going to do, we're going to fill the reservoir with oil, and we'll get the reservoir back onto the shock body. We're going to try and get as much oil into the reservoir as possible because it's easier to do it now than once it's back on. When you've got a bladder reservoir, it works a little bit different because you can fill the reservoir from the bottom side. The bladder fits in from the bottom. But on a piston type piggyback, you've got to get the oil in at the top. There is another way to do it, but that all hinges, and on this shock there's a screw port which I can't get loose. I don't want to risk damaging it further, but if we could get that loose, we could do it with basically a vacuum bleeder. In this instance, we're not going to do it that route, purely because that screw seems to be seized after all the years, and I'm not willing to risk breaking the aluminium shock body for the sake of getting a screw loose. So what we'll do, we'll get the shock oil ready, and we'll basically get some oil into the reservoir. We're going to fill it up pretty much to the brim. Okay, and you've got to give it a couple of little knots because there's going to be air bubbles come out from around the side of the piston. Okay, so we're going to just get that shock oil up, a couple of small taps just to get those air bubbles out. And we're going to get it right up to the circular groove. Okay. Now what we've got to do, we've got to get this back over that O-ring, and in so doing we're going to force some of the oil through the channel in the top of that shock body. Once we've got the piggyback onto the actual shock, we're going to install that circlip and we're going to pull it backwards, and then we're going to flip the shock upside down, and we're going to start filling oil into the body itself. What we'll do, we'll get this on fairly carefully. You'll see a little bit of oil will smidge out, squirt out in some of the grease. We'll get that pushed on. I'm just going to do it over the tray because we are going to squeeze some of the oil out. Right, then what we're going to do, we've got to get this circlip installed back into that shock body, into that groove. Again, very limited space in the foot to do it, so we'll try and push it in as best as possible with a seal pick. Can give you grey hairs, these. I'm actually going to try and hold it in the vise. It just frees up my hands a little bit. I know you can't really see it. I have to get this. Right, there she's clicked in. So we've got the piggyback back on. You can see it turns fairly easily because of that excess grease we put on. Right, now what we'll do, we'll flip the shock body over and we'll give it a bit of oil, try and fill that channel, and we're going to try and get all the air out of that channel as well. Just give it a couple of taps. Right. Then what we're going to do, we're going to grab the shock body in the vise, and we're going to basically fill the oil up to around the first circular groove in the shock body, between the first and the second one. Right. Now what we'll do, let's make sure this is tight. We're going to basically force we're going to force the oil through the piston. So what we need to do is, some of the oil is going to bypass the side of the piston and the ring, and some of it is going to go through the piston. So to get the oil through the piston, you need to give it a bit of a shock, that it flexes the shims. And for doing that, you can either use a small wooden block on top of that with a hammer, or a rubber mallet. Both are good options, both work. So what we'll do is we'll get the piston installed. And there we go. You can see the oil is already coming through. So get the excess oil out of the way. Helps if I build a hammer. Rubber mallet quickly. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to give this a light tap. What I say, cover around. The oil has a tendency to want to squirt out during this process, so sometimes you need to cover up, just to prevent everyone getting bathed in oil. Right. So now what we'll do, the shock shaft and piston is in the body. We seem to have oil right to the seal head, which is what we want. And we're going to start pushing that seal head in and into the body. What we're going to do is just do a quick check to see if that piston has moved. It hasn't really moved much, but as we force everything in, the piston could move backwards slightly. Let's see if the little seal head driver we made will fit. Yeah, it's not going to fit around that dust seal. Fitted around the old one, but this one is a slightly different one, so yeah, that's not going to work. What we're going to have to do is just try and see if we can push it down 2 screwdrivers to be able to get the snap ring in. So the idea that we want is to get the seal head into the body, and what we want to do is just depress the shaft a couple of times to get the oil moving through. And what we'll do, we're going to push the shaft all the way down. We're then going to flip it so that we're going to flip it over so that any air that's in the piggyback goes to the very top. And what we'll do is we'll pull that air back through. We'll then flip it over again. So we should have 0 air in the piggyback, and we should have pretty much oil throughout the channels. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and lift the seal head out. You can see it pull that piggyback down as well. We're going to lift that seal head out slightly, just a smidge, and we'll refill the oil underneath it. That is just the air gap that's been taken out. So we'll just top up underneath the piston. In a rear shock, you don't want any air. You can avoid it because air bubbles create problems in the valving. So that's how we get rid of the air. We'll then push this in. You'll see you're going to get a little bit of oil squirting out. There it goes. I'm going to have to try and squeeze this one a little bit. Okay guys, so after a little bit of pushing and prodding, we got the seal head into the body. So I'm going to reinstall the top circuit, split ring that goes in, and we need to make sure that it clicks into the actual slot or the gap. There we go, that's in nicely. So now we can pull back on the shaft itself. That is pretty much at full extension. That's going to go and secure that against that retaining ring, split ring. There we go. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to clean the area around here. We'll put a little bit of bearing retaining compound on the new seal head dust cover, and we can tap that in, and then we'll clean the rest of the shop, and we'll get the nitrogen bolt fitted. There's that one, and we'll charge up with nitrogen. So let's get this cleaned quickly. So we can loosen that from the vise. Again, safety glasses, because this stuff, if it gets in your eyes, burns like hell. Give it a little swirl. Make sure we get it all out. You just take a paper towel and dry that cap off. Make sure there's no oily residue inside there. And you can basically see the new seal head installed. So we can get the dust cover fitted now. What we'll do, let's just get it back into the vise. So what we do on the seal head, we use a team with a little bit of Loctite. This is just a bearing retaining compound. And we can just put a smidge of that on the actual seal head, the mating surface. just stops coming loose with any vibration. And what we'll do, just use a little piece of wood, a mallet, and get that seal head installed. Right. So now that we've got the seal head installed, the dust cover, and just wipe off that extra retaining compound. Right. Then we need to reinstall the charging bolt. So you can see that bolt has got a little rubber insert in it. What we're basically going to do, we're going to stick a needle through, a syringe needle, which we connect to our nitrogen charging setup, and we'll charge the nitrogen through that rubber. Afterwards, when you pull it out, the rubber basically closes. So we'll just get a little bit of grease onto that O-ring, make sure it seats nicely. So inside the center of the bolt, I'll just try and wipe the dirt off. There's a little rubber insert, and basically what we do is we stick a syringe needle. Just try and get this loose. So that's the charging needle that we use, and that basically goes through the rubber. We insert it through, we blow the nitrogen through the needle, and when we pull it out, the rubber will close up and close the hole. We're just going to put a tiny smear of grease on to make sure that O-ring seats nicely. We'll reinstall that bolt. We might have to just flick this so we can grab on the reservoir piggyback. Just to be able to tighten it up. Just snug that bolt up. Right, then what we'll do is put a tiny smear of grease on the needle. We'll get the needle installed. Just take the cap off. So this fitting is also available from Racetech. Nitrogen charging needle, got a conventional Schroeder valve fitting on the back, which our nitrogen charging tool fits to. So what we'll do is we'll basically insert that needle carefully through the rubber, like that, and we'll get ready to charge up the canister with nitrogen. So that's our nitrogen charging assembly. What we'll do, we'll get that fitted up now, get it connected, get the nitrogen set up, and then we'll be able to charge up with nitrogen. I'll get the nitrogen hose hooked up and we'll be back in a second. Okay, so we've got our nitrogen set to approximately 9 bar, where we want to be on these shocks. So what we'll do, we'll get our nitrogen charging adapter hooked onto the needle, and what we'll do, we'll have to tighten that with a wrench. I heard the piston move. We have now got nitrogen flowing through the needle. So now that we've got the nitrogen charge, we can just put the shock back again. And what we want to do is just do one compression stroke on the shock. Maybe it's better to do it on the bench. When the shock returns like that on its own, you know it's good to go. Right, so guys, that is basically the successful rebuild so far on the TZR shock. What we're going to do, I'm going to just put a little bit of grease in the spherical bearing at the bottom and get the bearing dust covers installed back on there. I'm going to put the small little screw back in there, and then I'll give the shock a good wash down with degreaser, and we'll install a spring and a retaining ring, and then we're ready to get it fitted back on the bike. So I'm going to back the preload adjusters all the way down so that we'll be able to get the retaining ring in, and then we can get the shock cleaned up quickly. I'll do that off camera, and then we can get the spring refitted. So let me clean the shock up off camera and I'll be back in 2 seconds. Right guys, so cleaned up the shock and we are ready to refit the shock spring. So what we need to do is this little adapter plate, or that's the retainer plate, let's call it, needs to come down with the bump rubber. We can then get the shock spring slid over, and what we do is we'll lift up the bump rubber and the retaining plate, and then our retaining ring slides in. So you need to get that bump rubber down slightly. Our retaining ring slides in underneath the retaining plate into the shock. We can push the bump rubber back up just to hold it, and then what we'll do is we'll wind our preload rings just to take up the initial slack, and we'll set the preload back to where it was. So we might have to just drop that slightly to be able to get the preload set. Right, let me get my preload spanner quickly and we'll get that preload set. Okay, so using a preload adjusting spanner, we'll get that preload on the spring set. So this specific one on the shock body, there's pretty much a mark of where they were. So we'll take it back to the same position. Use the smaller side. Probably about 7 or 8 turns, full turns, just to get that preload. Right, so there we're at the mark where it was. What we'll do, we'll bring our locking ring up against the preload adjusting ring. We'll nip it and then we'll just give it a light tap with a soft punch again to lock it in position, similar to what we did when we started dismantling the shock. So those two rings are going to bind up against one another now. And what we'll do, just to lock it, we use the brass punch again, and we'll just tap it into, just to get to lock the two rings. Right, so those locking rings are in position. Everything's locked up. I just need to put a little bit of grease in the spherical bearing, the bottom shock bearing. So what we'll do, I have cleaned it. You can see the sphere in the bearing rotates quite freely. So what we'll do, we're going to just put a little bit of grease in there to prevent some water, or any water from getting in. A little bit on both sides. So the spherical bearing is really a bearing where there's minimal movement on it. They do have a tendency to seize up quite easily, so I like to clean them with a bit of degreaser. Can even use standard petrol, gas, diesel, whatever you've got handy. And then the side spaces, we'll just get that excess grease from the outside of the seal a wipe. Make sure it doesn't attract any dust. And then the side spaces literally just pop in like that. Give them a turn just to get any air bubbles out. Right guys, so that's it for a shock rebuild that, like I said, Yamaha consider a sealed system. I think that was quite a successful mission, so I hope you guys enjoyed watching. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed the video, and also let me know where you guys are watching from around the world. Interesting to see where all these videos reach to. So looking forward to the next one, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care for now. Cheers, bye.